Hi, Anthony and Bob Barker are back, and today we're going to be talking about where we get our wood from. Now, this isn't an in-depth tutorial about all the different intricacies of each different wood species. It's just the quick and dirty of what you need to know as a DIYer or a relatively newer woodworker to get started on your projects. So let's get into the video. So getting started, before you go get your materials, you got to figure out what you're going to need. So for my general process, I come up with a design, figure out what type of material is going to be best for that particular project. So I think it'd be good just do a quick overview of the main materials that we will use. And for me, that's typically going to be hardwood, softwood, plywood, and MDF. Those are the staples that I use for the majority of my projects. And when I first started, one of the big things that kind of confused me is what the heck is the difference between hardwood and softwood? I had no clue. In general, hardwoods tend to be harder than softwoods. They come from different types of trees. It's the leafy trees, but it doesn't really matter. Deciduous versus coniferous doesn't matter for what you're going to be doing. All that matters is for the hardwoods, those ones will be more resistant to dings and dents and things like that, which is why they make great wood for furniture or other things that is going to be experiencing a lot of wear and tear. In general, for the hardwoods, they do tend to be denser, a little heavier, and a little bit darker in color than the softwoods are, but they're also more expensive, so that's something to keep in mind. The trees that they come from are slower growing, so it takes longer to be able to replenish the supply, which also adds into the cost of it. So with the hardwoods, you're talking species like walnut, oak, maple, that type of thing. With softwoods, then you're talking more like spruce, pine, fir, redwood, those type of ones. They're much faster growing. They tend to be softer overall, lighter, and also the grain pattern is not usually nearly as prominent as with the hardwoods, although, like I said before, there's always exceptions to every rule. So with the softwoods, you can still use those for the same projects you would with the hardwoods. You just need to be aware of their different material strengths and limitations and kind of work around that, or just kind of accept those as features within your projects. Next is plywood, which is essentially just layers of wood glued together. And typically what you're going to have is a pattern where the grain goes one way and then the next layer is going to go 90 degrees to it, and so on and so forth for however many layers that particular piece of wood has. So nice, good, flat surface that's relatively stable, so you don't have to worry about like wood movement and that type of thing, so great material to use. And of course, MDF is very similar to the plywood in that it's just a nice flat sheet. It's made of like more of a particle material, and it does have a very hard and resistant face surface, although the edges are a little weak, so just things to keep in mind. So once I get my material needs figured out, then I decide where I'm going to go. And to be honest, my general preference tends to be the lumberyard. For one, they have just a bigger supply and they tend to be cheaper for the wood that I'm getting, but that's not always the go-to for me because it's a much more of a drive and a bit more of a hassle, to be honest, to go to the lumberyard than it is just my local box store. I have multiple box stores that are very close. It's a familiar environment, easy to navigate. The pricing is very transparent. You just see the tag there and that's what it costs. It's a little bit more difficult at the lumberyards. For certain projects, I do prefer the box stores at times. So in general, when you're going to the box store, you do have to understand that they do cater more to general construction and things like that, so they don't always have the material for the finer projects. So you do want to keep that in mind when you are doing your project. You may have to do different alternative types of woods or go for a different look if that's your only available option, or if you really just don't want to go to the lumberyard. And they tend to have a much larger softwood supply, and like I said, they tend to cater more to construction, so they have lots of dimensional lumber. And when you do use that dimensional lumber, you have to keep in mind that it tends to be wet, very high moisture content, and the edges are always rounded, so if you're ever joining pieces together, you need to take that into account. And they are very prone to twisting, cupping, whatever type of movement it can do, it will do. And if you go down those aisles, you'll notice that every single piece seems to be twisted or cupped or bowed in one way or another. You can take a little while, but it's always good to sort through there and get the pieces that are going to be the straightest or the ones that have the look that you're going for. And one thing that you can do to help mitigate with moisture content is look for lumber that is labeled KD/HT. KD is kiln dried, so that's going to get rid of the majority of the moisture content. HT is heat treated, so that helps get rid of pests, insects, that type of thing, and fungus, so you won't have that to deal with. You do want to avoid, or at least keep in mind when you're seeing something that's SGRN or AD, that's air dried, and the other one is a surface green. Those ones will have a high moisture content. Often when you just grab the wood, you can feel the moisture in it. And so when you get that home, you're gonna have to let that kind of set and acclimate for a while, or you're gonna have to use that in a project where it doesn't matter if it's gonna be moving like as it dries. Now my local box stores, they do have some hardwoods. And the nice thing about the hardwoods at the box store is they tend to be very uniform sizes, and they're surfaced on all four sides, so straight edges and flat faces. So that is kind of helpful if you don't have the equipment to mill down your lumber at home. However, it is expensive and the supply tends to be limited. At my local box stores, it's mostly red oak. So they do have that if I need small amounts for it. They do have an okay supply of some of the softwoods like pine and things like that that you can use for projects. And it's actually one of my go-to for some of the trim pieces I use, like the poplar that I often do on some of my projects here in the workshop. And the plywood at the box store tends to be construction grade. If you look at the edges, there's all these voids and gaps. It's not as structurally sound as some of the nicer sheets, and the faces aren't always as pretty. However, there are exceptions. You will find some good pieces there, but the supply, the options are going to be limited compared to the hardwood stores or lumber yards, and the prices tend to be much more expensive for the plywood, just like it is for the hardwoods. For MDF, I've noticed the pricing and the selection kind of tends to be pretty much the same for my box stores and my local lumber yards. So if I just need a sheet of MDF, I just jump down to my box store, and that's just an easy one to go for. And they do have equipment to cut down your wood for you at the box store. However, their blades are pretty rough and they leave the edges not very nice at all. So just keep that in mind. If you do go to there and you want them to cut it down for you, leave a little extra material that you can kind of clean up later and trim off the rough edges to get the finished piece that you're going to use. So that brings us to going to the lumberyard, which I would definitely advise to do just in general, just to go check it out, get familiar with it, see what the options are. It can inspire you for projects. So for the hardwoods, they're going to have a much larger supply.
Often they'll have some live edge slabs. These ones are cedar, but they also have walnut all the time. And they have some stumps that you can use for different projects, and of course the different types of hardwoods. Here you see I have some walnuts surrounding some purple heart, then some teak, and a lot of these I don't even know how to say, but then we have some alder, some jatoba, cherry, white oak, some birch, some African mahogany, and many others besides that.
And the pricing for it tends to be significantly cheaper than I'll get at the box stores. One thing you do need to keep in mind that the lumber that's sold at the lumber yards, they tend to be labeled and priced very differently than what you'd be used to at the box store. So for the labeling, you're going to have different components of it. One, it's going to be sold in the board foot, by the board foot, and that's basically just a unit of volume. There's ways you can calculate it yourself. I'll put those right up here. But you can also just get a calculator on your phone and calculate it out, which is kind of useful to do because I noticed most of the guys, when they're pricing it, they kind of eyeball the size. So, they could be over, under. So it's good just to have a general idea of what you expect it to be. And also for the sizing, it's labeled in quarters. So it'll say like 4 quarters is basically, each quarter is 1/4 of an inch. So that's a 1 inch thick piece. 8 quarters would be a 2 inch thick piece. 2/4 would be a 1/2 inch thick piece. So keep that in mind. It's just labeled differently for the thickness. And they don't always come in uniform lengths, widths. Like it'll say, like the one I go to, it says RL and RW, which is random length, random width. But they do tend to kind of put them together in relatively similar sizes, so then you can kind of pick out that and then get it down to the final dimensions when you get those pieces at home. And as far as the surfacing at the lumber yards, there's pretty much every option. You can get it all the way from rough lumber to S4S. S4S is when it's surfaced on all 4 sides, just like at the box store. So you're going to have nice, smooth, flat faces and straight edges. But they also do S3S, which is going to have the 2 flat faces and 1 straight line. And some places call it S2S R1E, which is ripped 1 edge, or SL1E, straight line 1 edge. Essentially, that just means 1 edge is not going to be straight, which is not a big deal for most projects because you're going to kind of rip it down to your liking and to your exact dimensions anyways. And you can go down even less and less for that. Less and less surfacing, and it does get a little bit cheaper the more rough the lumber is, which can be good, but also less helpful if you don't have the equipment to mill it down. So extra things to keep in mind when you're there. And of course, they do have the equipment to cut down the pieces of lumber to help you transport it if necessary. However, a lot of the lumber yards are going to have different requirements of leftover wood you need from the boards. So say you're getting you wanted like a 5-foot long piece of walnut, and all they have is like 12-foot ones. For a lot of lumber yards, not a problem. You just cut off 5 feet. You pay for whatever the board foot equivalent is of that piece you're getting. But certain ones, they have a requirement for the leftover piece. I've seen it where they want like 4 feet left over. I've seen ones where they want 8 feet left over. So you'd have to find that one out at your individual lumberyard, what that requirement is going to be for the pieces that you do want cut down. And for most of the wood at the lumberyard, and in general, they have a very complex grading system. But to be honest, I kind of ignore most of that. Like for me, it's just going to be an eyeball test for like all of my wood to see if it's the right look and it feels like a good piece for my project. So I don't really think that's a big deal to go over the very specifics of the individual grading systems. The next one at the lumberyard is going to be the plywood. And as you can see here, there are a ton of options at the lumberyard. And there's going to be varying quality as well. And one thing that I do tend to pay attention to is how good the lamination pieces are, if there's a lot of voids or things like that, and that kind of goes into the grading of it. But you can just kind of look at the edges and see if they're just nice and flush, like say the Baltic birch pieces, or the other more construction grade where you see the voids, then you know it's going to be less of a quality piece. But in general, the bigger thing is really going to be the face. And there is grading for the faces, but you're just going to mainly look at it. And for surfaces that you're going to be visible or not painting, you want to make sure it's the ones without the patches or plugs in there. And also keep in mind that each side of the plywood could have a different grading. So you can have a higher grade, so like a better aesthetically looking piece on one side and less so on the other side. So you want to kind of flip around and check both sides to make sure the other side looks good enough for the project as well. So overall, the box store is a great resource for many things, but for many of the projects, it just doesn't compare to your local lumberyard. So I would greatly encourage you, get out of your comfort zone, go give it a look, give it a shot, see what's there. See what kind of new woods or species you can kind of work with or play around with and have fun. So that's it for the video. I hope it's helpful as you guys are thinking about what you need to do for your next project. And I also just wanted to mention that I know my videos have been a little spaced out lately. I've been having some issues with my shoulder, just being an old man. Once I get that sorted, I will be back to the regular projects like before. So we'll see you guys in the next one.